most important thing the Buddha ever said about karma is also the simplest. Intention is karma. What you bring to a moment matters more than what the moment brings to you. That is the whole teaching, right there. And yet most of us have spent years looking at karma from exactly the wrong angle, treating it like a ledger, trying to figure out what we did to earn the painful things. What old mistake or forgotten wound attracted the loss, the rejection, the slow accumulation of exhaustion? We have been looking at our own suffering like a bill that arrived without explanation, searching for the debt that produced it. Many people listening to this right now have carried that same question for years. The Buddha looked at that way of living and pointed somewhere else entirely. Karma is not the universe keeping score. The word at the heart of the teaching is intention. What you bring to your actions shapes the quality of your mind. And the quality of your mind shapes every experience that follows. Cause and effect. The same quiet law that makes one thing follow naturally from another. This matters because it means the painful things that arrived in your life were not punishments. And understanding that, truly understanding it, is where suffering starts to change. This is a listening about that understanding. It moves through what the Buddha actually taught about karma, why the hardest chapters of a life so often become the most clarifying, and the one practice that transforms suffering from something you endure into something that finally teaches you, not by removing the difficulty, by changing the one who meets it. There is a version of you that acts from fear, a version that acts from habit, a version that acts from genuine care, and often all three are doing the exact same thing at the same time. The Buddha called that distinction karma. The karma lives beneath the action, in what generated it. Think about the last time you helped someone. Really think about it. You showed up. You did the thing. From the outside, it looked like kindness. And it may well have been. But if you stay with that memory a moment longer and ask honestly what was actually moving in you when you did it, something more complicated sometimes surfaces. Maybe you wanted to help. Maybe you were afraid of what it would mean about you if you didn't. Maybe some part of you needed them to see you as the kind of person who shows up. Maybe all of those things were true at once, layered over each other in the way feelings tend to be. None of them entirely wrong, none of them entirely what you would have named if someone had asked. The action looked the same in every case. The karma was not. Or think of a different kind of moment. Something you agreed to when you should have said no. You said yes. You did what was asked of you. And afterward, there was that particular flatness, that low-grade resentment with no clear target, a tiredness that wasn't quite about being tired. That feeling is information. It is the mind registering the gap between what was done and what was driving the doing. You said yes from something that was not actually generosity. And the mind knows the difference, even when the words looked the same, even when the action looked the same. even when no one else in the room could have told. This is what the Buddha was pointing at in one of the most direct statements in the entire Pali Canon. In the Nibbedika Sutta, he said it plainly. Intention, I tell you, is karma. Intending, one does karma by way of body, speech, and mind. 3 channels: body, speech, and mind. And intention, moving through all 3, almost always below the level at which the judging, assessing part of the mind can see it clearly. The Pali word for that intention is cetana. It does not mean the conscious decision you make before you act. It is closer to the quality that animates the action, the flavor of what is driving it. Fear has a flavor. Craving has a flavor. Goodwill has a flavor. Defensiveness has a flavor. These are not metaphors. They are felt realities that the body registers before the thinking mind has named them. Fear tends to arrive as a tightening, something that draws inward, contracts, prepares for impact. Craving tends to arrive as a reaching, a leaning forward, a pull towards something just out of reach. Resentment tends to arrive as a kind of heat, a held tension around an old story that the mind keeps returning to. And goodwill tends to arrive as a small opening, a warmth in the chest that doesn't need anything back, that has no agenda attached to it. Most of us have learned to skip past all of this. We move directly from impulse to action, and the only pause we make is the one the thinking mind uses to justify what we were already going to do anyway. We construct a reason after the fact. We call it a choice, and then we judge the choice by its surface, by what it looked like, by whether it worked, by whether other people approved of it. The flavor that drove it never gets examined at all. Take the channel of speech first, because it is the most familiar. 2 people can say the same words. One says them from genuine concern. The other says them because they want to appear concerned. To anyone watching, the words are identical. The face might be identical. The tone might even be identical. And yet something is different, and the person receiving those words often senses it without being able to name it. Something in the way it lands. Something that either opens the chest slightly or leaves it strangely flat. The difference is cetana. The difference is what was moving underneath the words. Now take the channel of the body. You hold a door. You sit with someone who is grieving. You carry something heavy when someone else is struggling. All of these look like care from the outside. But what was moving in you when you did them is what the Buddha was interested in. Were you there because you wanted to be, or because you couldn't tolerate the discomfort of not being there? Were you helping because the help was needed, or because being the one who helps is part of how you have learned to feel safe in a room? The action is identical. The root is not, and the mind knows it even when no one else does. And then the channel of the mind, which is the most consequential of the 3 and the least examined, because the mind makes karma continuously, in ways the body never expresses and speech never voices. Every time you return to a grievance and feel the heat of it build again, every time you rehearse a conversation that hasn't happened yet and clench around the version you want, Every time you catch yourself thinking well of someone simply because they exist, without needing them to be anything in particular for you, the mind is always working. It is always making something. The only question is whether you know what it is making and from what quality of root. There is a further complication that the teaching does not flinch from. The three channels do not always move together. You can say caring words while the mind holds resentment. You can perform a generous act while the body carries exhaustion and bitterness. You can sit with someone in silence while the mind is rehearsing a grievance against them. When the channels are working at cross purposes like this, the karma being generated is not simply the karma of the visible action. It is the karma of the whole interior climate, which the thinking mind often does not see, and which the person on the receiving end of it sometimes does. This is why the Buddha's teaching on karma was never primarily about behavior. It was about what generates behavior from the inside. The court of the mind that judges actions is almost always judging the wrong level. When the movement behind an action is fear, what follows in the mind is more fear. The action might look perfectly reasonable from the outside. It might even achieve what it was aimed at. But the mind that acted from fear is now a little more practiced at fear, a little more convinced that fear is the correct response to this kind of moment. The groove deepens. The habit becomes more automatic. The next time something similar arises, fear arrives a little faster, a little more certain it should be in charge. This is karma working exactly as the Buddha described. As cause meeting effect in the most private place there is, inside the mind, before anyone else can see it, before the action even fully takes shape. The same principle moves in the other direction with equal precision. When the movement behind an action is genuine goodwill, not goodwill performed for an audience, not goodwill calculated to secure an outcome, but the real thing, the simple, warm wishing well that asks nothing back, the mind that acts from that place grows more capable of it, more familiar with how it feels to act without clinging to what follows, more at ease, less defended, not because anything in the world has arranged itself differently, because the internal ground has changed. There is a teaching story from the early tradition that stays close to this. Sunita was a street sweeper. In the social world he was born into, this was among the lowest positions a person could occupy. He cleaned the roads. He was not permitted in certain spaces. He was not spoken to by certain people. And yet when the Buddha came walking along the road one morning, Sunita stood to one side to let him pass, and the Buddha stopped. He looked at Sunita and asked if he would like to join the community of practitioners. What the tradition remembers about Sunita is not that he had any external advantage. He had none. What it remembers is the quality of his intention, the care he brought to the most unremarkable work, the absence of resentment in a life that had given him every reason for it, the quality of attention he brought to each ordinary moment, not because anyone was watching, not because it would bring any reward, but because that was the quality of mind he had cultivated. Sunita went on to attain liberation. His verses in the Theragatha, the songs of the elder monks, and it is luminous. The story is not about a cosmic reward for virtue. It is about what intention, sustained and clear, does to the mind that holds it. The karma of a life lived with that quality of attention was simply this: a mind so clear and so unencumbered that liberation was the natural outcome. He had not sought a reward. He had not tracked a balance. He had simply tended the quality of his mind in the work that was in front of him, one ordinary moment at a time. In the Mahakatarisaka Sutta, the Buddha named 3 specific qualities of intention that he placed at the very foundation of practice. He returned to them throughout his teaching life because they are not abstract ideals. They are recognizable movements of the mind that anyone paying attention can begin to work with. The first is the intention of renunciation, not in the dramatic sense of leaving everything behind, but the quieter, more daily movement of releasing the grip, releasing the need to possess the moment, to control the outcome, to make what is happening into something other than what it already is. There is a fist somewhere in the mind that is almost always holding something. Renunciation is the practice of slowly, voluntarily opening it. The second is the intention of goodwill. Metta in Pali, the genuine wishing of well-being for others and for yourself, even on the days when it does not come naturally, especially on those days, because the practice does not live in the moments when goodwill is easy. It lives in the moment when someone has frustrated you and you feel the pull toward hardness, and you choose, quietly and without announcement, to wish them well anyway. The third is the intention of non-cruelty. Meeting difficulty, your own failures and shortcomings included, without adding more hardness to what is already hard. The mind is often its own cruelest critic. It returns to its own mistakes with a persistence it rarely applies to anything else. And the karma of that internal cruelty is very real, very present, and almost never examined. 3 intentions: renunciation, goodwill, non-cruelty. The Buddha offered these not as commandments but as qualities that can be cultivated, the way steadiness or patience can be cultivated through repeated, patient attention given to the right place. And the right place is exactly what this teaching is pointing at. The movement that happens before the action, the quality at the root. The Pali phrase for the kind of attention this requires is yoniso manasikara, wise attention, or the kind of looking that goes all the way to the source. The tradition uses this phrase to describe the capacity to trace an action back to the intention that produced it, and to do that tracing without judgment, with nothing more than clear and steady seeing. This is not self-surveillance. The distinction matters. Self-surveillance tightens. It produces self-consciousness, the exhausting vigilance of a mind convinced it is always one impulse away from failure. A mind under surveillance performs rather than simply being. It edits before it feels. It manages before it understands. Wise attention loosens. It brings the unhurried recognition of what is actually moving in you, followed by the equally unhurried possibility of something different. The Buddha asked his students to observe themselves the way you might watch water moving in a stream, not judging the current for moving the way it moves, simply noticing what it carries, simply noticing where it tends. The water does not need to be corrected. It needs to be seen. In an ordinary day, this looks like very small moments. The pause before you reply to a message that irritated you, in which you can sometimes catch the irritation before it speaks. The half breath before you say something in a conversation, when the familiar urge to defend yourself arrives and you notice it arriving. The moment you are doing something kind and you stay with it long enough to ask, without judgment, what is actually behind the kindness? Or smaller than that, the tone of a reply you almost sent and then softened. The moment you caught yourself replaying a grievance and chose, quietly, to set it down. The meeting where you noticed the urge to speak and recognized it was coming from the need to be seen rather than from anything the room actually needed. These are not dramatic moments. They are the moments where karma is actually being made. In the quality of the movement that happened before anyone else could see. Seeing what is underneath the action is the practice, and that seeing, repeated across many ordinary moments, across days and then weeks and then something longer, begins to change things in a way that no amount of willpower manages to. The actions that used to arise from fear begin to arise less often from fear, because fear has been noticed so many times that it no longer arrives completely unannounced. The impulses that used to run below the threshold of awareness begin to surface sooner, to become visible earlier, to become something that can actually be met. And what gets met, over time, with enough patient attention, begins to soften. The defensiveness that used to move so quickly it felt like reflex slows just enough to be recognized as defensiveness. The craving that used to pull the hand forward before the mind had even registered the movement becomes something the mind can feel arriving, can name, can choose to follow or to simply watch. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a gradual clarification, taking place in the smallest possible increments, in moments no one else will ever see or recognize. It is the karma of attention itself. What you find when you begin to look there honestly is rarely what you feared you would find. It is rarely malice. It is almost always a mind trying to protect itself, or reaching for something it believes it needs, or so long accustomed to a particular way of moving through the world that it has stopped noticing whether that way is still serving it. That recognition, when it arrives without a verdict attached, is not a small thing. It is the beginning of the only change that goes all the way down. The kind the Buddha kept pointing at when he said intention is karma, and that intending happens by way of body, speech, and mind, in every ordinary moment, whether we are watching it or not. The question is never whether you are making karma. You are, right now, in this moment, in the quality of attention you are bringing to this listening. The only question is whether you are doing it with your eyes open. And the eyes, the teaching says, can be opened, not through force, through attention, through the patient, repeated, quietly unglamorous practice of looking inside the action and meeting what you find there with honesty rather than verdict, understanding rather than judgment. The beginning, again and again, of seeing clearly. Intention does not only shape what you do, it shapes what you experience. Because the mind that goes before the action also goes before the interpretation of everything that arrives in a life. Before what you make of what happens to you, before the meaning you place on a moment before you have even finished living it. And it is in that layer of meaning, in what the mind adds to raw experience before understanding has arrived, where so much of what we call our life is actually being lived. Watch what happens in the mind before a difficult conversation begins, before a word has been spoken, before the other person is even in the room. The mind has already been there. It has already run the exchange, anticipated the response, stoked the grievance or braced the defense, and arrived at conclusions, all before a single actual thing has happened. By the time the conversation begins, the mind has already decided what it means. This is the ordinary operating mode of the mind. It runs ahead. It scouts. It arrives at the next moment carrying everything from the last one and the one before that, and the accumulated weight of a year or a decade of similar moments. And then it calls what it finds there reality. Watch it before a meal you are about to eat. The mind has already decided whether this will be satisfying before the first bite. Watch it before a phone call from someone whose name you recognize on the screen. Something shifts in the body, some quality of readiness or resistance, and that shift happens before the call has begun, before a single word has passed. Watch it before a piece of news. The bracing has already started. The hoping has already started. The mind is already somewhere other than here. The mind goes before, always, in everything. And because it goes before, it shapes what follows. The quality of the mind brought to a moment determines, to a degree most people have never examined, what that moment is able to offer. A conversation entered with a mind already clenched around an outcome gives back a clenched conversation. A morning met with a mind still weighted from the night before gives back a heavy morning. The circumstances may be identical. The quality of mind walking into them is what determines everything. The Dhammapada, the oldest and most loved collection in the Pali Canon, opens with a statement about the mind. A plain statement. 2 verses. The tradition placed them first, before anything else in the entire collection, because everything else rests on this. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, suffering follows as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox. If one speaks or acts with a serene mind, happiness follows as a shadow that never departs. The word corrupt here is worth pausing at. The Pali points toward a mind that has been clouded, muddied by craving or aversion or confusion, that has been allowed to settle without examination. And serene points toward a mind that has been gradually cleared of these accumulations, through attention, through the willingness to look at what has been building inside without flinching from it. The image of the wheel and the ox is precise in a way that rewards attention. The wheel follows the ox as pure consequence. Simple, mechanical, impersonal. The wheel carries no opinion about the ox. The ox carries no opinion about the wheel. One moves, the other follows. This is how things connect in a world governed by cause and effect. And that is precisely the framing the teaching wants. Cause and effect, plain and honest and without any judgment written into it. The mind that precedes the action is the ox. What follows in experience is the wheel. And the wheel follows with a faithfulness the thinking mind almost never accounts for, because the thinking mind is absorbed in what it is doing and forgets to notice what it is generating. Consider a mind carrying resentment it has never fully named. The quiet kind. The kind so long established it no longer registers as resentment. It lives now as a slight hardening, a low constant pressure, a readiness to find in certain people or situations exactly what it has long since decided is true of them. That mind walks into an ordinary exchange, a neutral moment with nothing particular in it. It reads what it finds through the lens it already holds. Words arrive, and the burdened mind catches in them a slight, a dismissal, evidence for the case it has been quietly building for months. The moment offered none of this. The wheel followed the ox faithfully into territory it had no cause to enter. The same movement happens with anxiety. A mind carrying unexamined worry meets a quiet Sunday afternoon and converts the stillness into unease. The rest the afternoon offered goes unreceived. The mind arrived before the afternoon did, filled its space, and returned more tired than it went in. Or grief. A mind still raw from loss attends to something beautiful, a piece of music, a late afternoon light through a window, and finds in the beauty the sharpness of what is absent. The beauty was entirely real. The mind that met it had already gone somewhere else. The wheel follows the ox into whatever terrain the ox is already traveling. Every time. The second verse turns this in another direction. A serene mind produces an experience that follows like a shadow that never departs. The shadow image is precise. A shadow accompanies. It goes everywhere the body goes, without being asked. The serene mind produces a quality of encountering the world that accompanies every situation. A particular kind of presence that is available to whatever actually arrives. A mind rested in its own clarity meets a disappointment and can feel it fully, without the disappointment detonating everything the mind had been holding in reserve. It meets a difficult person and can see the difficulty without needing to construct a story around it that confirms a long-held belief. It meets uncertainty and holds it steady, without collapsing it prematurely into a conclusion just to get relief from the discomfort of not knowing. The serene mind arrives lighter. It meets what is actually here. The shadow it casts follows it everywhere, and the shadow is clarity. The Buddha described his own practice of watching thoughts. Before his awakening, he began to notice which thoughts his mind returned to most readily. Thoughts of craving, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of distraction, and thoughts of something else entirely. Clarity, gentleness, the quiet release of things that no longer needed to be carried. He described sorting these with care, returning again and again to the second kind, through the simple act of sustained attention toward a different quality of mind. He watched the first kind of thoughts, named them, saw where they arose from, and then he gave his attention somewhere else. The Majjhima Nikaya preserves this account. The Buddha sitting with the movement of his own mind, long before anyone called him the Buddha, learning what the forerunner tended to carry. What this looks like in practice is far quieter than the word practice implies. It is noticing, before opening the laptop in the morning, what the mind is already carrying. Whether the first reach of the day is toward openness or toward something already contracted. Whether the morning begins wide or begins already narrowed to a point. These are small discriminations. They require almost nothing except the willingness to pause for 2 or 3 seconds and sense the quality of what is about to lead the day. It is catching, in the middle of a tiring afternoon, the specific texture of what the mind is about to do, the way it reaches, in those low moments, for a comparison that will make the hour feel more bearable, or a memory that confirms a fear that has been building quietly somewhere out of view, or the familiar groove of a thought that has been given so much attention it now arrives without invitation. The catching is the practice, the seeing itself, nothing more than that. The mind does not need to be fought into clarity. What it needs is repeated witnessing, the way a stream deepens its channel through a landscape over years of movement. The mind deepens the pathways of its most frequented thoughts. Each time the mind reaches for resentment and finds it smooth and well-worn, the path becomes fractionally more automatic. But the same is also true in the other direction. Each time attention arrives and holds steady on the quality of what is here, without the usual overlays, a different channel begins to form. Gradually, without announcement, over time. A mind that has practiced this, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, for a modest amount of time meets its own difficulty differently. The grief still arrives. The worry still arrives. What also arrives, fractionally, perceptibly, in ways that take time to recognize, is a quality of steadiness underneath them, a quality of ground that difficulty lands onto and does not destroy. The reason the Dhammapada placed these 2 verses first is that they are the most useful thing it could say. The quality of the mind is what determines the quality of the life. Attend to the mind, and you have attended to the root of everything. Leave the mind unexamined, and everything else you attend to passes through a lens that distorts before it delivers. The quality of the mind can be known. The mind is available for examination. It can be watched. It can become an object of attention rather than an invisible driver of everything. The watching itself changes things. The way that bringing any hidden process into view changes it, simply through the act of seeing. The mind reveals itself in small moments. The catch in the chest before an unwanted task. The tightening at a familiar name. The way the whole quality of an hour shifts because of a single thought that arrived and departed in 10 seconds. These are the wheel and the ox in their smallest, most ordinary forms. They happen many times in an ordinary day. The practice the Dhammapada is pointing toward is the practice of noticing them, of becoming familiar with the mind's own movement before it completes itself, of learning, through repeated and patient attention, what the forerunner tends to carry before it arrives. This noticing is its own form of karma. Each moment of genuine seeing, each moment in which the mind catches itself mid-movement and recognizes the quality of what is driving it, is a moment in which the groove of habit becomes fractionally less automatic. fractionally less invisible. And in that fraction of increased visibility, something opens. The possibility of bringing something different to the next moment. Something the mind has not quite brought before. A mind that begins to know itself in this way changes the ground that experience arrives onto. It does this gradually, incrementally, in the smallest possible units. The wheel still follows the ox. The ox is simply carrying less, and the experience that follows is shaped accordingly. The tradition calls this the beginning of purification. The word sounds larger than the thing. The thing itself is ordinary. It is a mind slowly learning to see itself more clearly, in the gap between an experience arriving and the interpretation placed on it. In that gap, small as it is, the practice lives. That gap is where the forerunner can be caught in the act, examined for what it is carrying, and given the chance to travel lighter. Even a mind that has traveled lighter for years still meets a life that includes difficulty. The painful things still arrive. What changes is what the mind does in the first moment after pain lands. Because there is the pain that life delivers, and there is what the mind reaches for immediately afterward, almost before the pain has fully registered. A second thing, layered on top of the first, that deserves its own careful look. Pain is not what makes suffering. The mind's response to pain is what makes suffering. The Buddha drew this line with extraordinary care in a teaching so precise and so practical that it changes the relationship to difficulty from the first time it is properly heard. Two things arrive in every difficult moment. The first is the difficulty itself, the event, the loss, the pain that landed. The second is what the mind does with the difficulty in the seconds and hours that follow. These two things are not the same. They feel the same because they arrive so close together that the gap between them is almost invisible. They have different sources, different textures, and very different consequences for the life being lived inside them. The practice the tradition offers is the practice of finding that gap, learning to feel the difference between what arrived and what the mind assembled in response. The Buddha described this with an image so simple it takes a moment to let it settle. When a person is struck by an arrow, he said, they feel pain. Then the untrained mind shoots a second arrow into the same wound. And the suffering of the second arrow is layered on top of the first, compounding it, amplifying it, making it almost impossible to know which part of the pain belongs to what actually happened and which part belongs to what the mind has done since. This teaching comes from the Salatena Sutta, preserved in the Sayutta Nikaya. The word sala means arrow. The teaching is about the two of them, and it may be the most practically useful thing in the entire canon for someone living an ordinary life in difficult circumstances. The first arrow is the pain that arrives without being invited. Physical pain, loss, disappointment, something ending that you wanted to continue, something beginning that you wanted to avoid. The first arrow is impersonal. It does not arrive because you deserve it. It arrives because conditions produced it, and conditions do not consult your wishes before producing what they produce. The first arrow is simply part of being a body in a world where things change. It hurts. The Buddha acknowledged this without equivocation. The life of an unawakened person includes pain. The life of an awakened person includes pain. The first arrow arrives for everyone. The second arrow is everything the mind does immediately after. Feel into what that looks like on an ordinary day. A relationship phrase. The pain of it is real, and it arrives fully formed. But the mind does not stop there. It begins to run the timeline backward, asking where the moment was when things shifted, what was said that caused it, what was left unsaid that might have changed the course. It runs the timeline forward too, constructing scenarios of what this means, what will follow from it, what category of loss this belongs to. And somewhere inside the backward and forward running, it begins to assign responsibility to them, or to you, or to both, in proportions that shift depending on the hour and the quality of exhaustion. The first arrow, the relationship is painful. The second arrow, the years of accumulated grievance the mind now weighs against this moment. The case it builds, the verdict it delivers, the further suffering it creates by treating the pain as evidence of something larger and more final than what is actually here. Or a body breaks down, illness, exhaustion, a limitation that was not there before. The physical experience is the first arrow. The mind begins asking why, what was done or not done that led here, whether this is permanent, what this means about the future, about the kind of life still available. Each of these questions, arriving in the body as a new weight, a new tightening, is another arrow. Some people suffering from a single first arrow are simultaneously carrying a quiver of additional ones, all fired from the same bow. The mind, trying to make sense of something it cannot control by wrapping it in narrative. Or something smaller, a piece of feedback that stings, a plan that fell through, a night of poor sleep. The first arrow is the thing itself. The second arrow begins in the sentence that follows. This always happens. I never get it right. This is what my life is. Small pains made enormous by what they are made to mean. Grief is a particular case worth attending to. Grief is one of the first arrows the mind is least willing to leave alone. It arrives with a weight that is physical, whole body, impossible to locate in a single place because it seems to permeate everything. And the mind, encountering something this large and shapeless, almost immediately reaches for the structures that will make it manageable. The story of who is lost, the catalogue of what will never happen now, the particular conversation that will never be completed, the question of why now, and why this person, and why when there was still so much left. These thoughts are understandable. They are the mind doing its best with something too large for its ordinary tools. And still, they are second arrows. They add a sharpness to what is already sharp. They take grief, which is the clean pain of love meeting loss, and weave through it a suffering that extends beyond the grief itself. The grief at the loss of a person, and then the grief at the grief, the wondering how long it will last, whether it will ever lift, whether the depth of it says something damning about the future. The first arrow of grief does not ask these questions. It simply hurts with the fullness of what was loved. The tradition honors this. It does not ask the grieving mind to stop feeling. It asks only that the pain be allowed to be what it is, without the mind adding its own weight to a weight that is already complete. This is the mind doing what it was trained to do. There is no judgment in the observation. The mind narrates because narrating gives it a sensation of traction, the feeling of doing something in the face of something being done to it. The story feels like a form of agency. If the mind can understand the pain, it can perhaps influence what happens next. If it can locate responsibility, it can perhaps prevent a recurrence. If it can name the category of loss, it can perhaps prepare for what follows. The second arrow is still an arrow, and it still pierces. Most people were never taught that the first arrow and the second arrow are different things. Pain arrived in childhood, and the adults nearby responded to it with stories, explanations, assignments of blame, reassurances that the feeling would pass sooner than it did. The implicit lesson was that pain required management, that it needed to be wrapped in something else before it could be survived. So the second arrow became the default response, a reflex wired so deeply, so immediate and so habitual that most people arrive in adulthood without ever knowing the first arrow as its own distinct experience. The practice does something simple with this long habit. It introduces a pause, not a pause that delays the story indefinitely, just long enough to feel what arrived before the story about what arrived. Long enough to register the sensation as sensation before it becomes evidence for something, or proof of something, or an argument about something. That pause, practiced in small moments over time, gradually becomes available in larger ones. The tradition points toward a particular kind of attention as the practice, learning to distinguish, in the lived moment, which layer of pain belongs to the first arrow and which belongs to the second. This is a somatic practice as much as a mental one. It happens in the body, in real time, in the middle of whatever is happening. It might sound like a question asked quietly, just below the level of ordinary thought. Is this the event? Or is this the story the mind is constructing around the event? Is this the pain itself? Or is this what the pain has been turned into? The question does not make the pain disappear. Nothing in this teaching promises that. The first arrow is the first arrow. It arrived and it hurts, and that is simply what is true. The question does something more modest and more useful. It creates a small gap between the event and the elaboration. A moment of noticing that the second arrow is being loaded before it is released. In that gap, something becomes possible. The mind, accustomed to moving straight from pain to story without pausing, meets a moment of hesitation. A moment in which the automatic reach for narrative is interrupted by something more curious than reactive. A steadiness that can hold the first arrow without immediately adding to it. This is what the Salatena Sutta calls the response of the trained mind. The trained mind still feels the first arrow fully. It does not bypass pain or create distance from what is real. The training is precisely the capacity to feel what is actually here, cleanly, without the second layer pulling the experience into territory the original pain never occupied. Sit with a difficulty for a moment without narrating it, without moving to what it means or what caused it or what must happen next. The first arrow is here. Feel its exact shape, where it lives in the body, what quality it has, whether it is sharp or diffuse, whether it moves or stays in one place, whether it is hot or cold or simply heavy, the sensation itself without the story. The body knows the difference before the mind does. This is worth settling into. When the first arrow arrives and nothing has been added to it yet, the body holds something that is painful but also bounded. There is an edge to it, a shape. The chest tightens in a specific place. The throat holds something. The belly draws in. The sensation is real and present and localized, and it is, crucially, this size and not larger. The second arrow changes the body's experience. As the mind begins the story, the body begins to respond to the story as though it were also happening. The shoulders tighten around something that has not yet occurred. The breath shallows around a future that exists only in the mind's construction. The jaw holds something said years ago that the narrative has now brought forward. The body is managing 3 timelines at once. The past that caused this, the present that contains it, and the imagined future it is being extended into. And it holds all 3 of them as though they are equally and simultaneously happening. Returning to just the first arrow means returning the body to just one timeline, the one that is actually occurring. The breath steadies. The sensation remains painful, but it is this painful and not more. The body, released from carrying 2 additional timelines, has something left over, a small reserve of steadiness it did not have access to a moment before. Notice how much space that creates, how much less the body holds when the story is set down, even briefly. The pain may remain the same size, but the suffering built around it has a different weight than the pain itself. Feeling the difference, even once, changes something in the body's relationship to the next moment of difficulty. The second arrow also has a particular sound. Most people recognize it immediately when it is named. It sounds like, "Why does this keep happening to me?" It sounds like, "I should have known." It sounds like, "This is how it always goes." It sounds like, "Something must be fundamentally wrong with me, or with them, or with this whole situation." These are not observations. They are second arrows. They carry the texture of truth because they arrive so immediately, so seamlessly after the first pain, that the mind assumes they are part of the same thing. They are interpretation already wearing the clothes of experience. A thought that arrives in the voice of certainty is worth pausing at. The first arrow rarely speaks. It simply hurts. When the pain starts to speak, when it begins to make pronouncements about you or the future or the meaning of things, that is often the second arrow announcing itself. Learning to hear that shift from sensation to sentence, from what is here to what it means, is the beginning of something the tradition calls wisdom. The willingness to be honest about which layer of experience is being inhabited at any given moment. There is something important to understand about why the second arrow appears. The mind adds to pain because it genuinely believes more is required, that the pain needs to be processed, understood, justified, solved, that leaving it as just what it is would be insufficient, that something must be done with it, and the doing is the story. The teaching gently undoes this belief. Sometimes the most complete response to the first arrow is to let it be the first arrow, to feel the loss without constructing a verdict on it, to feel the pain without assigning it a meaning that extends beyond what it actually is, to let the sensation move through the body with the same naturalness that the body breathes, without the mind turning it into a case that must be argued and decided. This runs against every instinct the conditioned mind has developed. The mind was taught, implicitly, through years of responses to difficulty, that doing something is always preferable to simply being with what is here. The narrating, the analyzing, the case building, these feel like action. They feel like taking the pain seriously. The tradition suggests the opposite is also possible. Taking the pain seriously enough to feel it fully, without addition, without embellishment, without the protection of a story that turns sensation into narrative. This requires a steadiness most people were never shown how to develop, and yet the steadiness is learnable. It is what patient attention, returned to again and again, gradually produces. The second arrow also does something to karma that is worth understanding. When the mind responds to pain by reaching immediately for story, blame, or narrative, the intention driving that movement is reactive, rooted in aversion. The actions that arise from that state deepen the groove. They reinforce the pattern. The next pain arrives into a mind that has already practiced the second arrow, and the second arrow is loaded before the first one has fully landed. A mind that has learned to pause at the first arrow, to feel it for what it is without the elaboration, moves from a different place. The response that follows carries a different quality of intention. Something still needs to be done, said, addressed, but it arises from a mind that has not compounded the pain first. It arises cleaner, and what arises clean, the tradition teaches, creates conditions that are different from what reactive suffering tends to create. There is a gentleness in this teaching that it does not always receive credit for. The second arrow is not a moral failing. The mind that shoots it is doing what it learnt to do over a lifetime of meeting difficulty without anyone showing it another way. The observation of the second arrow is an invitation, not a correction. A gentle noting that the suffering built around pain is optional in a way the pain itself is not. And that optional suffering, once seen for what it is, begins to lose some of its hold. Slowly, and not all at once, and with many moments of the second arrow arriving before the gap between the two has even been noticed. The practice is the increasing frequency with which the mind catches itself in that interval, between sensation and story, between what arrived and what the mind is about to do with what arrived. In that interval, however brief, something else becomes available, a quality of meeting what is here that does not require adding to it. a steadiness that allows the first arrow to be exactly and only what it is. Pain, met fully, met without flinching, and without elaboration. That quality of meeting has a name in the tradition, and what it opens into is worth listening to with care. The word the tradition reaches for here is equanimity. It is one of the most frequently misheard words in all of Buddhist teaching. Most people, when they encounter it for the first time, hear something they already know. They hear resignation, the flat, exhausted state of someone who has stopped fighting what cannot be changed. They hear distance, the quality of a person who has learned to stop caring as a way of stopping the hurt. They hear detachment in its coldest sense, a mind that has simply closed itself off from what is difficult and calls that closure peace. This is not what the tradition means. The confusion is understandable, but it costs something important. Because a person listening for resignation will dismiss equanimity before it has had time to show what it actually is. And what it actually is, when it is felt rather than merely described, is one of the most relieving things the practice has to offer. Equanimity, in the tradition, is a quality of presence, a specific kind of groundedness that is available underneath experience, not instead of it. It is the difference between a tree that bends in the wind and a tree that has no branches. The branchless tree is undisturbed because there is nothing left for the wind to move. The tree with deep roots bends, moves, feels the full force of what arrives, and holds. Ajahn Chah, the great Thai forest teacher, used an image like this to describe what the practice is actually cultivating. The goal is not a life without wind. The goal is roots deep enough that the wind can move through without uprooting everything. This is equanimity. The capacity to be fully in contact with what is difficult, fully present to what is here, and still hold. The Pali word is upekkha. The tradition places it among the 4 Brahmaviharas, the 4 qualities of heart considered most essential to a life of genuine freedom: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and upekkha. It is listed last, and the ordering is deliberate. The old teachers understood that equanimity is what allows the first 3 to function without breaking down. Loving kindness without upekkha collapses into sentimentality. Compassion without upekkha collapses into exhaustion. Sympathetic joy without upekkha collapses into envy when the happiness of others seems remote from your own. Upekkha is the ground the other 3 rest on, the quality that keeps the heart open without being destroyed by what the open heart receives. Understanding this changes what the practice looks like. It is not the management of feeling. It is not the replacement of difficult feeling with pleasant feeling. It is the cultivation of a quality of presence underneath feeling that allows the full range of experience to move through without the whole structure collapsing. The grief is still grief. The frustration is still frustration. The fear arrives and it is still fear. Upekkha does not smooth these out or hold them at arm's length. It provides the ground they land on, a ground steady enough that the landing does not destroy what is underneath. Ajahn Chah described this steadiness in another way. He spoke of the mind as a still forest pool. Animals come to drink from it, unusual, beautiful, sometimes frightening animals. The pool does not chase the beautiful ones or retreat from the frightening ones. It simply remains what it is, still, clear, available to whatever comes. The animals see themselves reflected in the stillness, and they come and go. The pool remains. Most people have experienced a version of this, even without a practice. There are moments, often unexpected, when something difficult is happening, and underneath the difficulty, there is a quality of okayness, a steadiness that is present alongside the pain, present alongside it, accompanying it, running as a second quality through the same moment. The pain is real, and the okayness is also real, and both of these things are simultaneously true. That simultaneous truth is a glimpse of upekkha. The practice is the deliberate cultivation of what in that moment arrived by accident. What upekkha feels like from the inside is worth attending to because the description of it is so easily misread. It does not feel like numbness. Numbness has a specific quality, a kind of flatness, a muting, the sense that the volume of experience has been turned down. Upekkha is almost the opposite. It tends to sharpen perception rather than dull it. Things are seen more clearly from a mind that is not contracted around its own preferences. Colors appear slightly more vivid. Other people's expressions are more legible. The present moment has a texture it lacked when the mind was busy arguing with it. It does not feel like not caring. The care remains. The love remains. The desire for things to go well for the people one loves remains entirely intact. What changes is the compulsive quality that can attach to care, the sense that the caring itself must produce a specific outcome, that anything short of that outcome is failure, that the person doing the caring is responsible for results that were never entirely within their reach. Upekkha releases the compulsion while leaving the care. The care becomes steadier when it is no longer required to do the impossible. It feels, when it is present, like a widening. The usual sense of a self pressed up against its situation, straining at it or recoiling from it, loosens slightly. There is more room. The difficulty is still the difficulty, but it is held inside a larger space than the one the contracted mind was offering it. The larger space does not diminish the difficulty. It simply provides more ground for it to be what it is, without the ground giving way. This widening is available in stages. A practitioner of many years may hold significant difficulty inside genuine spaciousness. A practitioner of days or weeks may find only a moment of widening, a single breath in which the contracted quality releases fractionally. Both are the same movement. Both are upekkha. The size of the opening is not the point. The direction of the movement is what matters. There is also something upekkha does for the relationship with oneself that deserves its own attention. Most people apply a harsher standard to their own difficulty than to anyone else's. When a friend is suffering, The impulse is care, understanding, a certain tenderness toward the pain they carry. When the same person is suffering themselves, the standard shifts entirely. The internal commentary is sharper. The impatience with the difficulty arrives sooner. The demand that it end, or that it have a reason, or that the person somehow do better at enduring it, arrives before any genuine steadiness has had the chance to. Upekkha extended toward the self is one of the most radical things the practice asks. Holding one's own difficulty with the same quality of steady, non-reactive presence that would be offered to someone else in the same situation. The old teachers were clear that this is not self-indulgence. It is precision. The mind that meets its own pain with steadiness rather than judgment has more available for the moment that follows. The harsh internal commentary is itself a second arrow. Upekkha sees this and sets the second arrow down. What remains? When the second arrows are set down and the widening is available, is simply the first arrow and the ground it rests on, the difficulty and the steadiness present alongside it, neither in conflict with the other, both simply true. The common misunderstanding of acceptance as resignation makes it sound passive, something the mind does by stopping, giving up the struggle, releasing the grip, letting the defeated hand drop. The tradition holds a different understanding. Upekkha is not the absence of engagement. It is engagement from a particular place in the mind, a place that is not driven by the urgency of aversion, not contracted around the fear of what might happen, not reaching compulsively for an outcome that will make this bearable. It is the place in the mind that can look at what is here, fully, without flinching and without adding, and respond from that seeing. The response may be vigorous. It may involve action, change, effort, even considerable force. The difference is the ground from which it arises. Equanimity does not mean doing nothing. It means doing what is needed from a place that is not contracted by fear or inflamed by aversion. The Devadaha Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya preserves a teaching about this kind of discernment. The Buddha is distinguishing between what is worth attending to and what is worth releasing, between the places where effort changes things and the places where effort only adds more suffering to what is already here. The wisdom he is pointing toward is not passivity, it is precision, knowing, in a given situation, what is actually within reach, what effort will do something in, and what can only be held, accepted, allowed to be what it already is. This distinction is one of the most practically difficult things the practice asks of anyone. The mind that is used to doing something with difficulty resists accepting it precisely where acceptance is what is called for. And the mind that has slid toward passivity uses acceptance as a reason to avoid the effort that would actually change something. Upekkha, understood properly, is neither of these things. It is the quality of mind that can feel into a situation and know the difference. The word accept, in this tradition, does not mean endorse. It does not mean prefer. It does not mean that what is happening should be happening or that the person experiencing it deserves what they are experiencing. It means, this is what is here. This, right now, is what is true. The mind that can hold that simple fact without the layers of resistance and commentary and negotiation that ordinarily surround it, The mind that can simply know what is here without fighting the fact of its being here has freed up something considerable. The energy that was being spent on the resistance becomes available. The steadiness that resistance was consuming becomes available. And from that available steadiness, something useful can arise. There is a quality to this that can be practiced in small moments. A task that is unwanted, a delay that cannot be changed, a weather that will not cooperate. The small moments of daily friction. The mind's habitual response to these is a low-grade resistance, a tightening, a preference loudly registered, an argument with reality conducted inside the head, even though reality is entirely indifferent to the argument. These small resistances cost more than they appear to. Each one spends a little of the steadiness available. Each one confirms the habit of fighting what cannot be changed. And the habit accumulates across a day and a week and a life, until the mind arrives at its larger difficulties already significantly depleted. The practice of upekkha in small moments is the practice of catching the argument before it is fully formed, of meeting the unwanted delay and noticing. This is what is here. The noticing itself does not produce enthusiasm. It produces something quieter and more useful, a release of the energy being spent on resistance, a fractional return to steadiness, small in any given moment, significant across a life. The tradition is also careful about the relationship between upekkha and time. Equanimity is not an achievement that, once reached, remains permanently in place. It is a quality that deepens through repeated contact with difficulty and the willingness to meet difficulty differently each time. A practitioner who has cultivated it over years will still encounter situations that close them down. The contracted quality still arrives. The difference is the speed with which the contraction is recognized, and the availability of something underneath it to return to. This returning is itself a practice. Each time the mind notices it has contracted around something, has argued with what is here or demanded it be different, the returning to the ground of steadiness is an exercise of the same muscle that equanimity is made of. The noticing is not a failure. The noticing is the practice. Every return, however brief, however small, is a repetition that deepens the channel. The ground becomes more available because it has been returned to more times. Ajahn Chah said that the mind of genuine equanimity is like a person who stands at the edge of a busy road. The traffic moves. Vehicles of every kind pass through at every speed. The person standing at the edge sees them all clearly, does not step into their path, is moved by none of them into the road. They are fully present to the traffic. The traffic does not carry them away. This is what it is to be in a life without being consumed by it. To see clearly, feel fully, and hold steady. What upekkha ultimately opens into is a particular relationship with impermanence. The things that are here will change. The pleasant things and the unpleasant things and everything in between will change. The mind that has cultivated equanimity knows this as a felt quality of attention, lived in the body before it is reasoned in the mind. It meets the changing nature of things without the desperate clinging that makes pleasant things painful as they begin to leave, and without the desperate aversion that makes unpleasant things more painful by the mind's refusal to let them simply be what they are and run their course. This is what it means, in the end, to let something be what it already is. The allowing is active. It requires the full presence of a mind that has not turned away. It requires the willingness to know clearly what is here without immediately demanding that it be different. And it requires the steadiness, developed in small moments over time, to hold that knowing without being consumed by what it holds. The practice does not promise an end to difficulty. It promises something the tradition considers more valuable, a way of meeting difficulty that does not compound it, does not add the second arrow to the first, does not spend the resources of the mind on fighting what cannot be changed. A way of being in a life that includes difficulty without being defined by the mind's reaction to it. And even here, with this quality of meeting established, the mind will still generate questions, particularly about karma, particularly the large ones. Why did this happen to this person and not to that one? What determines the weight of the life a person is born into? Whether intention is truly enough, or whether something else, something older and larger and beyond the reach of present effort, is shaping things. The Buddha had a response to these questions. It was not the response most people expect. The questions are ones most people who have thought seriously about karma have carried at some point. Why does a person of genuine goodness face one kind of suffering, while someone of great cruelty seems to move through life with ease? Why does a child arrive into a life of poverty or pain before any intentional action of their own has had time to shape the conditions around them? Why does the working of karma, if it operates through intention as the tradition claims, produce results that look so often like randomness? How are the scales weighted? Who or what is doing the weighing? And if karma operates across lifetimes, how does the absence of a continuous self, which the tradition also teaches, make any meaningful sense of what is carried and what is received? These questions have a particular quality when they are lived rather than merely considered. They do not stay abstract for long. They arrive in the night after a diagnosis. They arrive at a graveside. They arrive when something has happened that seems entirely disproportionate to anything the person experiencing it could have generated. A child, an innocent, someone of particular goodness meeting particular suffering. The mind, encountering these situations, almost immediately reaches for the framework that will make it comprehensible. And karma, improperly understood, can be recruited into a framework of this kind that becomes its own source of harm. If everything that happens is the result of past karma, then every person who suffers has somehow generated that suffering. The logic, followed without care, produces a conclusion that blames the suffering for the suffering. The Buddha did not teach this. The Asinteya Sutta exists, in part, precisely to interrupt this misuse. The full working of karma is beyond what can be traced from any human vantage point. The person looking at another's suffering and concluding they must have earned it has reached into the imponderable and come back with a distortion. The unanswerable question, held open and pressed on, operates like a second arrow in the mind. It adds to the suffering of whatever difficulty is already present. The loss has arrived, and the mind is now also suffering the impossibility of fully explaining the loss. Two pains where one was. The question itself generating a suffering it had promised, if answered, to relieve. Setting the question down does not mean abandoning curiosity. The tradition does not ask for that. It asks for discernment about which questions are productive and which ones are not, in the specific sense that some questions, pursued further, lead toward greater clarity and less suffering, and some questions, pursued further, lead toward greater confusion and more. The Asinteya Sutta is a teaching about knowing which kind of question you are holding. The questions that are productive are specific. What is the quality of this intention right now, before this action is taken? What is the mind carrying into this moment? And how does that carrying shape what the moment is able to offer? What would it mean to bring something cleaner to this exchange, this response, this next small decision? These questions are answerable. They are answerable in the body, in real time, by the very mind asking them. And the answers, acted upon, change something. The Buddha returned again and again across 45 years of teaching to this, the available thing, the thing within reach, the part of karma that is vivid and immediate, available right here, legible to anyone willing to look with sufficient care at their own mind. This is what he called the path, the series of small, available choices that gradually reshape the ground from which all other choices arise. These are serious questions. They are asked in good faith by people who have sat with the teaching long enough to feel its edges. And the response the Buddha gave was not an explanation. It was a refusal. The Anguttara Nikaya preserves a teaching called the Asinteya Sutta, the teaching on the unthinkable. The Buddha identified 4 things he said should not be speculated about. 4 domains where the human mind, if it attempts to think its way to a complete answer, will come to grief. The full working of karma was one of them. The word asinteya means literally unthinkable, the precise meaning, beyond the reach of conceptual thought, a domain where the ordinary thinking mind cannot enter without producing distortion. The Buddha was specific about the consequence of trying: madness, or vexation, or simply a great deal of suffering applied to a question that will not yield under the force applied to it. This is not what a teaching of evasion looks like. A teaching of evasion changes the subject. This one names the subject precisely and then explains why it cannot be fully entered. The distinction matters. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching. He answered an enormous range of questions about the mind, about practice, about the nature of experience, about suffering and its end. When he declined to answer, it was because answering incompletely was worse than not answering. A partial answer to a question whose full answer is beyond human comprehension produces a distorted picture. The distorted picture produces suffering of its own. the full mechanism of karma, across time, across lifetimes, across the intersection of intention and result and circumstance and condition, is beyond what the human mind can hold. The tradition is not embarrassed by this. It considers the acknowledgement of this limit to be a sign of wisdom. A mind that can recognize the edge of what thought can do and knows what that edge feels like is a mind that has learned something important about its own nature. What the refusal protects against is a specific kind of suffering. The suffering that comes from trying to fully explain why things happened the way they did. Why this loss, at this time, to this person? Why that person carries the life they carry? Why the scales appear, from any given vantage point within the system, to be weighted as they are? The mind that insists on answering these questions fully will spend considerable resources on a project that cannot complete. It will loop. It will find partial explanations and push on them until they crack. It will import frameworks from elsewhere, attach cosmic significance to coincidence, and arrive at conclusions that either make the world too tidy or make it too meaningless. Both outcomes are a form of harm. The Buddha's refusal is an act of care. It says, "This particular question will not nourish you. What nourishes you is in a different direction." And he was clear about what that direction was. What is within the reach of human understanding and within the reach of human effort is not the full working of karma across all conditions. It is this moment, this intention, the quality of mind brought to whatever is here, the choice, available in every ordinary moment, to act from craving or aversion or confusion, or to act from something cleaner. This is the part of karma that is fully available, the part that requires no complete theory of how results distribute themselves across time, the part that requires no explanation of why a particular life contains what it contains. It only asks, what is the quality of intention in this moment, and what does the practice ask of it? There is a kind of liberation in this narrowing. The questions that cannot be answered are released, not because they are unimportant, but because holding them open was consuming something better spent elsewhere. The energy reaching toward the full explanation of why things are as they are becomes available for the only thing that can actually be shaped. The next moment, entered with as much clarity and care as can be gathered. The tradition points to something else in the refusal as well. The demand for a complete explanation of suffering, one that makes full sense of why things are distributed as they are, can itself become a form of resistance to what is here. The mind that insists the distribution must make sense before it will be at peace is a mind that has made peace conditional on an answer it will not receive. The Asinteya Sutta gently removes that condition. Peace is available now. The full explanation is not coming. Both of these things are true, and both can be held at once. What remains, once the imponderable questions are genuinely set aside, is the part of karma that is precise and practical and within reach. The part the Buddha spent his teaching life on, the part that requires no cosmic accounting, no complete theory of why, the part that operates right here, in the intention that precedes the action, in the quality of mind that meets the moment, in a law that moves through everything, carrying no opinion about the people it moves through. the relief the tradition points toward is real. It is the relief of a mind that has genuinely stopped fighting the limits of what it can know, that has recognized the difference between the questions it can live inside productively and the ones that only loop, that has, in the releasing of the imponderable, found something unexpected waiting on the other side. Not emptiness, but presence. The present moment, available and full, because the mind has finally stopped sending so much of itself elsewhere, which is worth understanding on its own terms. There will have been a moment, somewhere in your past, when you looked back at an earlier version of yourself and noticed that something had genuinely changed. A situation that used to produce a strong reactive response now produces something quieter. Something that used to close you down now finds, if not ease exactly, at least more room to breathe inside. A kind of patience that was not there before is now, sometimes, present without effort. The change did not announce itself. It accumulated, quietly, incrementally, in the texture of ordinary days. You did not sit down at any particular moment and decide to become different. Something was simply being built, in the repeated quality of choices made and intentions held, and then one day you looked back and saw that the building had happened. The tradition calls this karma, the visible fruit of invisible accumulation, and the law governing this accumulation has one quality that, once genuinely understood, changes the relationship to it entirely. It carries no opinion. The Ku-akama Vibhanga Sutta, preserved in the Majjhima Nikaya, contains one of the most direct treatments of karma in the entire canon. A young man named Suba comes to the Buddha with a question that most people have asked in some form. Why are people so different from one another? Why does one person move through life with ease and health and capacity, while another faces difficulty in every direction? Why do some seem to have more available to them? More time, more well-being, more of the particular resources a life needs to flourish? The Buddha's answer was precise. The differences between lives are the accumulated fruit of the patterns of intention that have built them. The person who has habitually met others with care and gentleness has been building something. The person who has habitually met others with harshness or cruelty has been building something else. These accumulations are not punishments or rewards assigned by an external authority. They are the natural consequence of causes that were planted. The same way a particular kind of seed, planted in particular soil, produces a particular kind of growth, with the same impersonality and the same faithfulness. The soil does not hold an opinion about the seed. It simply responds to what is given to it. Conditions produce what conditions produce. The person who planted the seed was not rewarded or punished by the soil. The soil simply grew what it was given. This is the law that has no opinion about you. What the Ku-akama Vibhanga Sutta shows, through the specific pairs it traces, is that the patterns of daily intention are not neutral. The person who has cultivated compassion as a repeated orientation, who has allowed the impulse toward care to become a habit of the mind and body, is building a particular quality of ground. The person who has cultivated resentment as a repeated orientation, who has allowed grievance to settle into the way they meet the world, is building a different kind of ground. The law does not approve of the first and disapprove of the second. It responds to both with equal faithfulness. Conditions produce what conditions produce. This impersonality is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the teaching. For people coming to Buddhism from traditions that include a judging God, the absence of judgment can sound like the absence of meaning. If no one is keeping score, why does it matter what is planted? The answer the tradition offers is that the law's response to what is planted is itself the meaning. A universe in which compassion reliably produces different conditions from cruelty, not because a moral authority decided it should, but because that is simply what those intentions, accumulated over time, build, is a universe in which intention matters absolutely. The absence of a judge does not make the consequences absent. It makes them more reliable. A judge can be appealed to. A judge can be moved by argument or sentiment. The law of cause and effect responds to nothing except what is actually planted. What this means for the person listening is something that takes a moment to settle into. The law carries no grudge. Whatever has accumulated in the past, whatever patterns of intention have been building in the years before this moment, the law has not formed a view about you as a result. It is not waiting to deliver a verdict. It is not tracking your score against some standard you may have fallen short of. It responds to what is planted. And it responds to what is planted now with exactly the same faithfulness that it responded to what was planted then. This means that the ground is always being prepared for what comes next. The gardener who has neglected a garden for years does not find, upon returning, that the soil has turned against them. The soil is what it is. Some work will be needed. Some conditions will need to change before the growth responds differently. But the soil does not hold the neglect against the gardener. It receives whatever is brought to it now. There is something in this that is important to hear in its full depth. Many people carry a private sense that the life they have so far is evidence of something. That the difficulties they have experienced, the patterns that have repeated, the ways in which they have fallen short of the intentions they held, are accumulating into some kind of permanent record. A record that defines them. A record that places a ceiling on what can be expected from here. The Chuchakama Vibhanga Sutta does not support this reading. What it supports is something more dynamic. Karma is not a fixed identity. It is a direction. What has accumulated so far is the result of the direction in which the seeds have been planted. And direction can change. Gradually, incrementally, in the same quiet and accumulative way that the original direction was established. The seeds of new intention respond to the law the same way any seed does. They grow according to what they are and what they are given. A small seed planted with genuine care is a genuine planting. The law does not withhold its response because the seed is small or because previous plantings were of a different kind. It responds to what is actually here. This is the part of the teaching that makes karma a field, open and responsive. The field is always ready. What is brought to it matters. And the law, carrying no opinion, holding no score, waiting with the same equanimity the tradition asks of the practitioner, will respond to whatever is given to it with faithful precision. The daily texture of this is worth attending to. Every encounter in an ordinary day is a planting of some kind. The quality of attention brought to a conversation, the quality of patience or impatience brought to a delay, the quality of care or indifference brought to a small task that no one will notice. These accumulate. They build the ground from which the next encounter is met. They build the quality of mind that will be available when something difficult arrives. The law receives them all with the same faithfulness, the large ones and the small ones, the ones seen and the ones invisible to everyone, including the person making them. The MN 135 teaching is, at its heart, an argument for the significance of the ordinary, the extraordinary moments of a life. The crises and the turning points are less determinative than the accumulated quality of ordinary ones. What is being built in the unremarkable moments is the ground from which the remarkable moments will be met. The law receives the ordinary with as much faithfulness as the exceptional. Every moment of genuine care is a genuine planting. Every moment of genuine attention is a genuine planting. The law does not distinguish between the moment you thought was important and the moment you thought was not. The teaching in MN 135 also speaks to something people rarely consider: the relationship between what we do for others and what accumulates in ourselves. The sutta traces how generosity, compassion, and the willingness to support others in their suffering build conditions that are not separate from the life of the person giving them. The gift changes the ground in two directions at once. It changes the conditions for the person who receives, and it changes the quality of intention that is now established in the mind of the person who gave. This is why the tradition places such emphasis on the texture of motivation rather than the size of the action. A large action performed from self-interest plants something different from a small action performed from genuine care. The law receives the intention behind the act more than the act itself. A meal given with resentment carries a different quality of planting from a meal given with warmth. The difference is invisible from the outside. The law registers it completely. This is a demanding teaching in one sense. It asks a kind of honesty about motivation that most people rarely apply. Sitting with an action that looks generous and asking, what is actually driving this? Is this care, or is it the desire to be seen as caring? Is this compassion, or is it the need to feel useful? Is this generosity, or is it an attempt to create an obligation? These questions are not asked in a spirit of suspicion. The tradition asks them because the answer matters for what is being built. Mixed motivations produce mixed plantings. A motivation gradually clarified through the practice of honest attention produces something cleaner. The law receives both with faithfulness, and the clarifying is itself a form of practice. The willingness to look honestly at what is driving the action and to choose, incrementally, to move towards something purer. The sutta also points to something about the relationship between karma and circumstance that is worth holding carefully. The conditions in which a life is embedded, the circumstances it moves through, are themselves the accumulated fruit of previous planting. This does not mean that every difficult circumstance is deserved. The Asinteya Sutta has already established that the full working of this across time is beyond what can be traced. What it means is that circumstances are always the meeting point between what has accumulated and what is being brought now. The same circumstance met from two different qualities of mind, produces two different experiences. The same financial difficulty met with clarity and care produces different conditions from the same difficulty met with panic and self-blame. The same illness met with some degree of equanimity produces a different texture of life from the same illness met with constant resistance. The circumstance is not the whole of the karma. What is brought to the circumstance is also karma in the making. This is the teaching's most practical instruction. The circumstances cannot always be changed. What can always be brought to them, at least in small measure, is something different from what was brought before. A slightly more patient response. A slightly less reactive orientation. A moment of genuine care where resentment would have been the easier choice. Each of these is a planting. The law receives them. The ground shifts, incrementally, in the direction of what is being given to it. The law that has no opinion about you is also the law that holds nothing permanently against you. This is worth staying with. The accumulation that has been built up is real. Its effects are real. And it is also true that new planting is always possible. The direction can always shift. The ground can always receive something different from what it received before. The law responds to what is brought to it now, with the same faithful impersonality it has always responded with, and will always respond with. There is a quality of attention the tradition asks for when looking back at one's own accumulated karma, an honesty that is paired with steadiness. The looking back is not for the purpose of judgment. It is for the purpose of clarity about what has been built and what direction the building has been traveling. Seeing the direction clearly is different from condemning it. The condemnation adds another layer of reactive intention on top of what is already there. The clear seeing allows something different. A genuine choice about the next planting. A choice made from seeing, not from guilt. From understanding, not from shame. These are very different grounds from which to begin something new. And the law, faithful as always, will receive whatever is brought from them. There is a particular kind of person who finds this teaching almost unbearably relieving. The person who has spent a long time carrying the sense that something they did, or failed to do, has placed them outside the reach of anything good the law might produce. Who has internalized the idea that the record so far is definitive, that the pattern established is permanent. The teaching says, that is not how the law works. The law has no memory in the sense of judgment. It has no preference for the past over the present. It responds to what is being planted now. And there is one act, simple in its form and profound in its karmic consequence, that changes the trajectory of what has been accumulating more fundamentally than almost anything else the practice points toward. The tradition calls it forgiveness, and its relationship to karma is worth understanding with care. She still flinches when she hears the name. Years have passed. The situation resolved itself, in the way situations eventually do, without resolution. But the body has not finished with it. The name arrives, and something tightens across the chest. A slight closing, a bracing that happens before any thought has formed. The body knows what the mind has been holding long after the mind has decided to move on. This is what unforgiveness feels like from the inside. Not dramatic in the way that pain is dramatic. A low, steady occupation, a portion of the mind's available space given over, permanently it feels, to someone who is not here. A portion of the body's available steadiness spent, again and again, on a situation that ended long ago. The Buddhist teaching on forgiveness begins here, in the body, in the involuntary response to a name, in the energy being spent every time the mind revisits the wound on something that is happening entirely inside the person who is holding it. The Dhammapada states this with a directness that lands differently the more it is sat with. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. The word eternal here is not rhetorical. The tradition is making a claim about the structure of reality. The same claim it makes about impermanence and about the nature of intention. Hatred, fed by hatred, does not diminish. It compounds. The mechanism is the same one that governs every other form of karma. What is fed grows. What is repeated deepens. What the mind returns to becomes more automatic with each return. And resentment is a form of return. Every time the mind replays the grievance, revisits the wound, runs the testimony again, it is not remembering the past. It is generating new karma in the present moment. The original harm happened once. The resentment happens every time the mind goes back. The person who caused the harm may be entirely unaware that this is occurring. The person holding the resentment experiences it fully, each time in the body. This is the inversion the Buddhist teaching on forgiveness offers. Forgiveness is not primarily something done for the person who caused harm. It is something done for the mind that is still carrying the harm. The old teachers sometimes express this with blunt precision. Holding resentment is like drinking poison and watching to see if the other person suffers. The other person, most of the time, has moved on. The person holding the resentment is the one still drinking. The Kakakupama Sutta, the source simile in the Majjhima Nikaya, takes this to its most radical expression. The Buddha tells his monks that even if bandits were to carve them limb from limb with a two-handled saw, any one of them who let anger arise toward the bandits would not be following his teaching. The instruction is to maintain loving kindness even then, to let the mind that could generate loving kindness in that moment be the measure of the practice. This is not a teaching that is comfortable to sit with. It should not be. It is not asking for comfort. It is pointing toward a quality of mind so trained in the impersonality of the law, so genuinely rooted in the understanding of what hatred costs the one who holds it, that even in extremity the mind reaches for something other than the compounding of harm. The saw simile is not a moral demand. It is a description of what full understanding of karma actually produces in a mind that has genuinely absorbed it. Most people will not be in the position of the saw. Most resentments are ordinary ones. A betrayal of trust. A cruelty delivered without apology. A person who took what was not theirs to take and left without acknowledgement. These are real harms. The tradition does not minimize them. What it asks is a very specific question about them. Who is continuing to be harmed by the holding of this? The answer, when the question is actually sat with, is almost always the same. The harm was done once by the person who did it in the conditions that produced it. The mind that cannot put it down has become the instrument of its own continued injury. The perpetuation of the harm has changed hands. The original person is no longer doing it. The mind holding the resentment is. Forgiveness, in this frame, is not a moral virtue one earns by being generous. It is an act of precision, a recognition that the mind cannot afford to continue doing to itself what the original person did to it once. It is the decision to stop being the instrument of one's own harm. Critically, it is not agreement. The Buddhist teaching on forgiveness does not require the conclusion that what was done was acceptable. It does not require reconciliation. It does not require any contact with the person who caused harm, or any communication, or any change in the practical boundaries that protect against future harm. Forgiveness and accountability are not in conflict. One is an internal act. The other is an external one. Both can coexist. What forgiveness releases is the internal continuation of the injury, the mind that no longer has to flinch at a name. The Tibetan tradition adds something to this that the Theravada framing sometimes leaves implicit. The person who caused harm was, at the moment of causing it, acting from conditions, from a mind shaped by its own accumulation of fear, craving, confusion, unexamined suffering. People who act from genuine freedom do not harm others. People who harm others are, in that moment, themselves suffering. They are acting from the quality of mind that suffering of that kind produces. This is not an excuse. It is a description. And the description, when it is genuinely seen, opens something that anger keeps closed. The recognition that the person who caused harm was themselves moving within the machinery of karma, their own accumulated conditions, their own unexamined intentions, their own causes producing their own effects. They were not, in that moment, free. What they did was the product of an unfreedom that belongs to them, not to you, and that the law is addressing in its own faithful way. The Tibetan practice of Tonglen, the meditation of taking in suffering and sending out compassion, applies this recognition directly. In its most advanced form, it is practiced toward the person who has caused harm, as a recognition that the one who harmed is also suffering, and that a mind capable of generating compassion toward that suffering is a mind that has moved, in a single act of turning, from the compounding of harm to the breaking of it. Now consider the karmic dimension of this movement. The mind that held resentment was, with each repetition, planting seeds of aversion, building the ground from which the next difficult encounter will be met with the same contracted quality, deepening the channel of reactivity, the mind that genuinely releases the resentment, that moves from the held grievance towards something that can acknowledge the suffering of the one who caused harm, plants something entirely different in the same moment. The ground shifts. The channel that was being deepened in one direction begins, slowly, to fill. This is how forgiveness changes karma, through the accumulation of moments in which the mind, given the opportunity to reach for the grievance, reaches for something else. Each of those moments is a planting. Each planting changes what the ground will produce. The law receives it with the same faithfulness it receives everything else. What makes the Dhammapada verse strange and worth returning to is the word eternal. The tradition is not offering a moral preference. It is making a structural claim, the same kind of claim it makes about impermanence. Not that things should change, but that they do, as a matter of how reality is constituted. Hatred met with more hatred does not resolve. This is not aspirational. It is descriptive. The evidence available to anyone who has observed a cycle of mutual grievance across a family, a workplace, a community, or a generation confirms it. Harm answered with harm produces more harm. The law does not suspend itself for the particular case in which the anger seems justified. It operates the same way it always operates. The implication for practice is precise. The person who decides to stop feeding the cycle is making a unilateral karmic intervention. They are removing themselves from a sequence of cause and effect that would otherwise continue through them. The sequence does not require their participation. It simply ends their portion of it. What the other person does with their portion is their karma to tend. What this person does with theirs is the only portion actually available. This is a more empowering position than resentment ever provides. Resentment carries the sense of agency, the feeling that maintaining the wound is a form of justice, a refusal to pretend that what happened did not happen. But the agency is illusory. The person holding the resentment has no effect on the person they resent through the holding of it. They have an enormous effect on themselves. The decision to stop is the decision to reclaim the one form of agency that is actually available. What is planted in this mind, in this moment, from here forward? The Zen tradition approaches the same truth differently as it approaches most things. Where the Theravada gives a mechanism, Zen tends to offer a question. When a student came to a Zen teacher carrying a grievance against someone who had harmed them, the teacher's response was sometimes simply, "Where is that person right now?" And the student, looking, would find the person nowhere except in their own mind. The teacher would then ask, "And who is doing the holding?" The question has no comfortable answer, because the honest answer is that the mind is holding itself in a posture of injury for the benefit of no one. The question does not resolve the grief of what happened. It illuminates the unnecessary portion of the suffering, the portion that belongs, as always, to the second arrow. The practice of forgiveness, across all the traditions that carry this teaching, is not accomplished in a single sitting. It is a practice in the exact sense that meditation is a practice. The mind will return to the grievance. The body will flinch at the name. The old anger will arrive, sometimes with the full force of the original event, sometimes as a low familiar ache. Each of these arrivals is an opportunity, a moment in which the mind can notice what has arrived, recognize what feeding it would cost, and choose, as many times as necessary, to not drink from it. The tradition does not promise this becomes easy. With serious harm, it may never become easy. What the practice produces is a widening of the space between the impulse toward resentment and the action of feeding it. That space is where freedom lives. Each moment the mind pauses in that space, rather than reaching for the familiar grip of grievance, is a moment of genuine practice. The law receives it with the faithfulness it always brings. The ground shifts, incrementally, in the direction of what is being repeatedly chosen. There is also something the tradition understands about the timing of forgiveness that is rarely said plainly. Forgiveness cannot be forced. A mind told it must forgive, before it has genuinely seen what the holding costs, will produce something that looks like forgiveness from the outside and feels like suppression from the inside. The suppression drives the resentment inward rather than releasing it, where it continues to shape plantings without the person knowing what is driving them. The practice the tradition points toward is a different movement. Seeing first. Seeing clearly what the resentment is, what it costs, what it continues to plant. From that seeing, the release becomes the natural response of a mind that has genuinely understood the situation. Understanding is the door the tradition points toward. There is a dimension of this teaching that addresses the harm done by oneself, the inward direction of the same practice, self-forgiveness. And the Buddhist treatment of this is one of the most philosophically strange and practically liberating things the tradition offers. Most people carry specific moments they cannot put down, things said in anger that change something permanently, failures of care at a crucial time, choices made from a version of themselves they have long since moved beyond, but cannot seem to leave behind. The self-condemnation is often harsher than anything the person would apply to someone else in the same situation, and it functions identically to outward resentment. It is a return, again and again, to a wound that the returning keeps open. The Buddhist teaching on non-self offers something unexpected here. The question of who exactly is forgiving whom, when the self is not fixed, is genuinely worth sitting with. The person who acted 10 years ago, in those conditions, with that degree of understanding, with that accumulation of causes driving the action, is not the person listening now. The continuity between them is real. The identity between them is not. The conditions that produce that action are not present in the way they were. The understanding that was absent then may be present now. Something has genuinely changed. To treat the person one was 10 years ago as permanently definitive of the person one is now, is to misunderstand what karma actually teaches about identity. Karma is a direction, the tradition says, not a fixed point. The self-condemnation that insists on the permanence of the worst version of oneself is itself a second arrow, aimed inward with extraordinary precision at exactly the place where the first arrow already landed. Releasing it does not mean denying what was done. The tradition is clear that actions have consequences, and that honest acknowledgement of harm caused is itself a form of practice. What it means is choosing to no longer be the instrument of one's own punishment for what has already been acknowledged. The self that can acknowledge clearly, can change direction genuinely, can act differently in the next moment, is not served by the continued condemnation of the self that preceded it. The law will receive what is planted now. The question is, what is being brought to it? She stops flinching eventually. The name arrives, and the chest still holds a memory of the tightening. But the tightening itself does not come the way it used to. Something has shifted in the ground. She did not decide to forgive in any single moment. She simply stopped, repeatedly going back. Stopped drinking from the thing that was making her ill. And gradually, in the space that the not going back opened, something else had room to grow. The tradition calls this the beginning of non-hatred. The ground cleared of what was being repeatedly planted in it, ready for something different to be given to it, waiting with the same patient faithfulness the law has always had for what will come next. We wake before anything has been decided. The hand moves before the eyes are fully open. The device is already there, already lit, already full of what accumulated while the body slept. The mind enters the day in the middle of someone else's urgency. The room, the quality of light, the fact of being awake in a body that has just returned from somewhere else entirely. None of this is received. The day begins at a run. Breakfast is made. The mind is already at the first meeting. The hands do what they have always done at this hour in this order. Someone speaks and the greeting goes out before attention arrives. The other person gets the form of being acknowledged without quite being met. Something slightly flatter than contact settles over the exchange. Neither person could name what was missing. The morning moves on. The queue at midday that is not moving. The system that has not done what the mind assumed it would. The elaboration begins immediately. This is always how it is. This is a waste of time that belongs to more urgent things. This is one more entry in a case the mind has been building for months. The elaboration adds nothing to the queue's speed. It deepens the groove of the mind's habitual response to obstruction. The queue eventually moves. The mind moves with it, carrying fractionally more of what it started with. By the time the next task arrives, the mind is already slightly more depleted than the task requires. The depletion feels like the day's fault. The mind does not notice what contributed to it. The afternoon conversation. The other person is speaking and the mind is forming the response while they finish. Words land. Some of them filtered through what is already believed about this person and this situation. The listening is partial in the way that most listening is partial. Enough to track the surface of what is said, not enough to receive what is beneath it. The pause arrives and the response goes out. Something that was being communicated beneath the words goes unheard. The exchange ends. No one could point to anything that went wrong. The opening for actual contact passed while the mind was somewhere else. Evening, the hour that belongs to nothing in particular. The hand moves again toward the screen, already offering a replacement for the stillness that has arrived. The stillness was available. It goes unreceived. The body rests in one sense. The mind has not rested. The ground of tomorrow is being prepared in this evening's soil. This is an ordinary day. Nothing in it would register to any witness as failure. The person who lived it would say it was fine. And in each of its unremarkable moments, something has been cultivated. The Pali Canon calls this karma, not the grand gesture, not the significant moral choice made under pressure, but the texture of habit laid down in the accumulation of small, unconsidered acts. The wheel following the ox, the ground receiving what was planted in it, faithfully, without opinion. The Mahāgātārīsaka Sutta, the great discourse on right intention in the Majjhima Nikāya, describes the second element of the Noble Eightfold Path: right intention. 3 orientations the mind can cultivate: toward renunciation, toward goodwill, toward harmlessness. These are not aspirations reserved for monasteries or for exceptional moral situations. They are directions, tilts of the mind available in any ordinary moment. Renunciation in the ordinary does not mean giving things up. It means releasing the grip of craving in small moments. The impulse to reach for the screen before the stillness has been received. The pull to fill the quiet rather than inhabit it. A fractional loosening of that grip is renunciation in its most practical form. Goodwill in the ordinary is not grand love. It is the quality of wishing well to the person at the counter, even briefly, even when the queue is long. The greeting that carries genuine attention. Harmlessness is the word chosen when a sharper word was available. The tone left out of the message that would have landed in the body of the person receiving it as something to carry. In every ordinary moment, these 3 tilts are available to be chosen or ignored. The sutta is explicit about what these orientations are and what they are not. They are not achievements arrived at once and held permanently. They are directions. The mind that has brought goodwill to the morning greeting and then failed it entirely by noon has not lost the practice. The next moment is available. The tilt can be brought more fully to the next action regardless of how partially it was present in the last one. This is the precise framing that makes ordinary moment practice possible rather than exhausting. There is no performance to maintain. There is only what can be brought to what is here. The Anguttara Nikāya describes 2 kinds of people in their relationship to difficulty. The first reaches for clarity when crisis demands it, when the stakes are high enough to make the reaching feel urgent. The second has cultivated that clarity so consistently in ordinary moments that when crisis arrives, the clarity is already present, already a feature of the ground rather than something to be summoned. The patient response that arrives in the difficult moment without effort is not native temperament. It is the accumulated product of patient responses made in hundreds of moments when nothing important was at stake, when the patients had nothing obvious to gain, when no one was watching. The early suttas are precise about this. The difference between these 2 people is what was built during the unremarkable time between the crises. The dramatic moments call on what has been cultivated. They do not cultivate it. What cultivates it is the small return, repeated, quiet, in the hours no one considers significant. The presence brought to the low-stakes conversation is what generates the capacity for presence in the conversation that matters most. The quality of attention given to the ordinary task is what trains the mind toward a quality of attention that will be available when the task is not ordinary at all. This is the argument the early teachings keep returning to. The ordinary day is the practice. All of it. Not a preparation for practice that happens elsewhere. The practice itself. Now the same day, same room, same sequence of hours. Nothing in the circumstances changed. We wake, The hand moves toward the device and stops. Not for long. One breath taken in the actual room before the day has been allowed to name itself. The quality of the light, the weight of the body, still carrying sleep before it has been converted into an instrument of the morning's demands. 5 seconds, maybe fewer. Then the reach. But something was planted in those few seconds that had not been planted in yesterday's first moment. The day begins on slightly different ground. Breakfast is made. The mind is still here. The hands do what they have always done, but there is a quality of accompaniment, the body not left alone with the task. Someone speaks and the attention arrives before the words are finished. The other person is met, quietly, nothing effusive, just someone actually present on this side of the exchange. The quality of contact is different. The person who received the greeting will carry something in the body that the first version of the greeting did not deliver, a quality of having been seen, brief as it was, that settles differently than the form of acknowledgement without attention. The morning carries it forward. The cue at midday that is still not moving. The frustration arrives the way the first arrow always arrives. And then there is an interval. The mind notices what it is about to do. The elaboration, the adding of weight to an already inconvenient moment, and pauses before doing it. The cue is slow. That is the whole of it. The elaboration is not planted. Something quieter, without name, is. The next task arrives, and the mind that meets it is carrying fractionally less than it carried yesterday at the same hour. This will not feel like anything in particular. It will feel like a slightly more ordinary afternoon than usual. The afternoon conversation. The other person is speaking, and the mind is here for more of it than yesterday. The pull toward forming the response too soon is felt and, partially, set aside. Something beneath the words is given a moment to arrive. A quality of being genuinely received enters the exchange. The other person may not be able to name it. They will carry it in the body regardless, in the quality of having been listened to rather than waited out. This exchange, like the greeting, like the pause at the cue, will not appear in any account of significant events. The law of karma registers none of this hierarchy. It receives what is planted with the same faithfulness it brings to everything. Evening, the hour that belongs to nothing. The hand moves toward the screen and pauses. The stillness is allowed in, not as a discipline, not for long. A few minutes in which the body is permitted to arrive at the end of the day without immediately replacing it with something else. The mind follows, gradually, into something between wakefulness and sleep, closer to rest than stimulation ever quite reaches. The ground of tomorrow is being prepared differently. The soil is not the same as yesterday's. This is the same ordinary day, and it was also, in the small ways that matter most, entirely different from the first. No witness could identify what changed. Nothing was achieved or announced. No one changed their plans because of it. The difference is below the threshold of what most people consider significant. The early teachings consider it almost everything, because the ordinary day is where every other kind of day is prepared. The Anguttara Nikaya's two kinds of practitioners are not two categories of people. They are two versions of the same person. the one who has built the capacity in ordinary time and the one who has not yet begun to. The ordinary day is where the version that arrives in the difficult moment is being assembled, piece by piece, in the unremarkable hours. What accumulates across a day of this kind is real, even though it is invisible. What accumulates across a week, a month, a year of ordinary days met this way is something else entirely. The mind that has been brought, repeatedly and imperfectly, toward the quality of goodwill in small exchanges begins to carry that quality without having to reach for it. The pause before the second arrow, practiced enough times in low-stakes moments, begins to arrive before the elaboration does. The space between impulse and action widens, fractionally, in ways invisible from outside, felt in the quality of how the mind meets difficulty when it arrives without warning. This is what the Anguttara Nikaya is pointing toward in its account of the two kinds of practitioners. The quality that is available in the difficult moment is the distilled product of the ordinary ones. There is no shortcut to it through grand gestures. It is built in exactly the way the early suttas describe all cultivation as being built, through the accumulation of small plantings, each one real, each one received by the ground with the faithfulness the law always brings. A mind brought to the ordinary moment with even a fraction more attention than it would normally bring has done something real. The fraction accumulates. What begins as a deliberate pause becomes, over enough repetitions, a natural inclination. The groove of habit shifts direction. The law of karma, impersonal, precise, without opinion about the person it receives, takes what is planted in each of these moments and produces accordingly. There is no minimum viable intention. Whatever is genuine in this moment is the planting. The Mahakatarīsaka Suta's framing removes what might be called the threshold problem, the belief that practice begins once sufficient conditions have been achieved, once the crises have quieted, once time has arrived, once the mind is calmer than it currently is. The early suttas offer a different logic. The quality of intention available right now, in whatever state the mind is currently in, is the material to work with. The practice does not wait for better conditions. It is what generates them. Over time, a practice of this kind stops feeling like effort. The pause before the second arrow, returned to enough times, begins to arrive on its own. The quality of attention brought to ordinary exchanges becomes less a deliberate act and more a texture of how the mind moves through the world. The practice has been absorbed. The cultivation has become character. This is what the early suttas call the fruit of right intention. Not a state of perfection held without effort, but a natural inclination toward what causes less harm, less grasping, less contraction in the world. We do not become different through single, significant choices. We become different through the quality of how we move through ordinary time. The slightly more present greeting offered once changes almost nothing. Offered as a cultivated habit, built in the moments when it required nothing, so that it is available in the moments when everything is required. It reshapes the ground from which everything else arises. This is what the whole of this listening has been pointing toward. The quiet, incremental, ordinary work of bringing something fractionally more awake to each available moment. We began this listening with a question about karma buried inside a video that called it fate. The early teachings answered differently. Karma is not what happens to us. It is what we bring to what happens. The intention behind the action, the quality of mind that precedes the word, the choice, available in every ordinary moment, to meet what is here with something approaching clarity and care. That choice is available now, in the quality of how this listening is being received, in the quality of what the mind does when this ends. In the first ordinary thing that follows, the law is ready for it. The ground is ready for it. The early suttas, patient as they have always been, have been pointing here all along. The body has been holding this for some time now. The breath is different from what it was. Slower. The chest a little less braced. Something has happened in the listening that the mind did not need to track. What is received